a 58-year-old custodian, mopped the same hospital hallway for 19 years. The chief of surgery walked past him every single morning. She never said his name. She never looked at his face. She didn't know he existed until the morning she collapsed in that hallway, and he was the only one there. He didn't call for help first. He didn't stand back and observe. He knelt down on a floor he had just cleaned, and he kept her alive with his hands until someone else arrived. She didn't know his name even then. She didn't know that the man who saved her life had applied to her department 3 times, that he had a son in medical school, that he had been denied benefits twice in the last year alone, that by the time the paramedics arrived and she opened her eyes, she was looking at a man who had every reason in the world to walk in the other direction. And he hadn't. Wendell Okafor had been at Meridian General Hospital in Columbus, Ohio for 19 years, 2 months, and 14 days. He knew this not because he kept a calendar, but because his son Isaiah had been 4 years old when Wendell took the job, and Isaiah had just turned 23 and was in his 2nd year at Ohio State College of Medicine. Wendell knew the hallways of Meridian General the way other men knew their own backyards. He knew which sections of floor tile buckled in January when the heating pipes expanded beneath them. He knew that the corridor outside radiology flooded if more than 2 inches of rain fell feast single night, and that nobody in maintenance would fix it because the estimate kept getting shuffled between departments like a letter nobody wanted to sign for. He was a big man, Wendell. 6 feet and some change wide in the shoulders, hands that looked like they had been carved for a different kind of work than pushing a mop. His father had been a steel worker in Pittsburgh. His grandfather before that. Wendell had been the first one in 3 generations to leave for something different, which had felt like progress at 22 and felt more complicated than that now. He had applied to become a patient transport specialist in 2017. He had the physical requirements. He had the training certificate he had paid for out of pocket from a program at Columbus State. He was told the position had been filled internally. He applied again in 2019. Same answer. He applied a 3rd time in 2021 and was not given a reason at all, just a form email that addressed him as Dear Applicant and wished him well in his future endeavors. He still had all 3 rejection emails in a folder on his phone. Not because he was bitter, because he believed that one day someone would ask him to show them, and he wanted to be ready. His wife Noreen had died in 2018. Breast cancer, found late, fought hard. The medical bills had taken everything they had saved, and then some. Wendell had taken on extra shifts. He had sold the house on Clement Avenue where Isaiah grew up, the one with the back porch Wendell built himself over a long summer, board by board, because he wanted his son to have somewhere to sit outside. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Whitehall. He kept the 2nd bedroom for Isaiah when his son came home on breaks from school. He did not talk about any of this at work. He talked about the weather. He talked about the Buckeyes. He talked about whatever the person in front of him wanted to talk about, if they wanted to talk at all. Most of them did not. In 19 years, Wendell had become as invisible as furniture. Dr. Silvana Reeves had been chief of surgery at Meridian General for 11 years. She had arrived at the position through a combination of genuine brilliance and the kind of discipline that does not allow for sentiment or distraction. She had trained at Johns Hopkins. She had published 41 papers. She had operated on a governor, 2 federal judges, and a professional athlete whose knee surgery was covered by 4 local news stations. She was 51 years old and had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days since her residency. She arrived at the hospital every morning at 6:15. She left between 8 lung C and 9 p.m., depending on whether there were complications or paperwork that refused to resolve itself cleanly. She walked the same route from the east parking structure to the surgical wing every single day. Past the pharmacy window, left at radiology, down the long corridor that ran beside the administrative offices, through the double doors, up the elevator to the 4th floor. Wendell mopped that corridor at 6 like every morning. In 19 years, their schedules had overlapped thousands of times. Silvana had walked past Wendell Okafor more than 4,000 times. She had not learned his name. This is not unusual. Studies on workplace invisibility consistently show that maintenance and custodial staff are among the least acknowledged workers in institutional settings, despite being among the most present. A 2019 survey of hospital employees found that more than 60% of clinical staff could not name a single member of their custodial team, even in facilities where those workers had been employed for over a decade. In a building devoted to human care, an entire category of human beings had become background. Wendell knew her name. He knew she took her coffee black and that she was left-handed and that she walked faster on Mondays than any other day of the week. He knew she had a daughter because there was a school drawing taped to the wall inside the surgical lounge that he cleaned every evening. A crayon house with a yellow sun and two figures holding hands, and at the bottom in a child's uneven letters it said, "For Mama." He had never told anyone he noticed these things. There was nobody to tell. On a Tuesday morning in late October, at 6:22 a.m., Silvana Reeves walked through the East Corridor moving fast the way she always did on mornings when her first surgery was scheduled before 8. The corridor was empty. Wendell was at the far end near the administrative doors, bucket beside him, just finishing the last section of floor. He heard the sound before he saw anything. Not a fall exactly. More like the absence of footsteps where footsteps should have been. A pause that became a silence that became wrong. He turned around. She was down. Not stumbled, not slipped. Down on her side, one arm tucked beneath her, the other outstretched, her coffee cup on its side 3 feet away, the liquid spreading in a dark arc across the tile he had just cleaned. Wendell did not hesitate. Not for a second, not for half a second. He was moving before his brain had formed a complete thought about what was happening. He reached her in 6 steps. She was unconscious, breathing, but shallow, too shallow. Her color was wrong. He checked her pulse the way the first aid training had taught him. The training he had recertified every 2 years for 19 years because the hospital required it. And because Wendell believed that if you were going to be in a building where people got sick, you should know what to do when they did. Her pulse was there, but it was not steady. He pulled his radio from his belt with one hand and kept the other on her. He called a code to the nurse's station. He gave the location. He kept his hand on her wrist and he talked to her, quietly, steadily, the way you talk to someone in the dark when you want them to know they are not alone. She could not hear him. He talked anyway. The response team arrived in 4 minutes. To Wendell, it felt much longer. To the data, 4 minutes is actually fast. He stepped back when they arrived, gave them the space they needed, told them what he had observed. Time of collapse, approximate, her breathing pattern, the pulse rate and quality. He said it clearly and without drama because he had been paying attention. And attention was the most useful thing he had available. One of the nurses looked at him and said, quickly, "Did you do chest compressions?" He said no, she was breathing. I didn't want to intervene beyond what was indicated. The nurse nodded and turned back. Wendell picked up his mop. He picked up her coffee cup. He moved to the side of the corridor and waited to see if anyone needed him for anything else. Nobody came to find him. Silvana Reeves was in the cardiac unit by 7 a.m., arrhythmia, undiagnosed. The kind that announces itself without warning, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes not. She was stable. She was lucky. The cardiologist used that word twice in the first 5 minutes. Lucky. Her husband arrived at 8:00. Her daughter, 9 years old, was brought in by a neighbor at noon. Silvana was awake by then. She held her daughter's hand and thought about the way the ceiling looked. When she opened her eyes and found herself on the floor of the East Corridor, and the voice she had heard, even through the fog, low and steady, saying, "You're all right? Someone's coming. Just stay with me now." She asked the nurse who had been there when she fell. The nurse said she didn't know. She asked a second nurse. Same answer. She asked the charge nurse who had responded to the code, a woman named Bethany who had been at Meridian General for 6 years. Bethany looked through the incident report. The initial call had come from a radio unit registered to the custodial department. She checked the assignment logs. Wendell Okafor, East Corridor, 6 to 8:30 shift. Silvana asked if someone could find him. It took 40 minutes. Not because Wendell was hiding, because nobody in the administrative chain responsible for locating a custodial staff member on a Tuesday morning had a system for doing it quickly. He came to the door of her room still in his work clothes. He stood at the threshold and did not come in until she asked him to. She looked at him. She had walked past this man more times than she could count. She did not recognize his face. "I was told you were there," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I was told you called it in." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at his hands, large, calloused, resting at his sides. "What's your name?" "Wendell Okafor." "How long have you worked here, Wendell?" 19 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Her daughter was asleep in the chair by the window. Her husband had stepped out to make a call. It was just the two of them in a room that smelled like antiseptic and cut flowers and the particular silence of places where serious things happen. 19 years, she said again, as if the number had a different meaning the second time she said it. Wendell nodded. He didn't add anything. He had learned a long time ago that silence was often the most honest response to a sentence that didn't really need one. "You probably know this hospital better than most people who work here," she said. Wendell considered this. He had a way of considering things carefully before he answered, which some people found slow and other people found trustworthy. "Probably the hallways," he said. She almost smiled. Then she said, "I want to thank you," he said. "I'm glad you're all right." That was not the same as accepting the thanks. She noticed. She was a surgeon. She noticed everything that happened in rooms. Wendell Okafor went back to work that afternoon. He had a second shift starting at 2, and he had already missed enough of his morning to put him behind on his section. He thought about the woman in the hospital room. He thought about her daughter sleeping in the chair. He thought about Isaiah, who was in a gross anatomy lab somewhere in Columbus right now, probably exhausted, probably eating something inadequate for lunch, the way medical students always seem to do. He thought about the back porch he had built on Clement Avenue that someone else was sitting on now. He did not think about whether the day would change anything. He had stopped expecting individual moments to change things a long time ago. That was not cynicism. That was just arithmetic. 19 years of not being seen didn't get corrected by one morning of being found. He mopped the radiology corridor. He replaced the caution cone by the flooded section near the east entrance. He put in a maintenance request for the third time this month about the tile that was lifting near the pharmacy. He clocked out at 8:47 p.m. and drove home to his apartment in Whitehall. Isaiah called at 9. He always called near 9. "How was your day?" his son asked. Wendell thought about the woman on the floor, about the 4 minutes, about her voice when he finally heard it, thin and confused, asking where she was. "Interesting," Wendell said. "Good interesting or bad interesting?" "Just interesting," he said. "How was yours?" Isaiah talked about the lab, about a professor who had explained something about the heart in a way that finally made sense to him, about a classmate who was struggling and how Isaiah had stayed late to help her go over the notes. This was the kind of person Isaiah was. The kind who stayed late for someone who needed it. Wendell listened and felt the particular pride that had no adequate word for it in English, the pride of a parent who sees something in their child that they tried to put there and genuinely isn't sure if they managed it or if it just grew on its own. He didn't sleep well. That was not unusual since Noreen. The nights were quieter than they should be. At 9 late the next morning, Silvana Reeves called the Office of Hospital Administration from her bed in the cardiac unit and asked to speak with the Director of Facilities Management. She had a question about an employee in the custodial department. A specific employee. She wanted to know his employment history, his evaluations, his current compensation, and whether he had ever applied for any other position within the hospital. The facilities director, a man named Preston Albee, who had been in the role for 3 years and had never once received a call from the chief of surgery about a custodial worker, was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would pull the file. He called back in an hour. Wendell James Okafor, 19 years of continuous employment. Evaluations that were, without exception, rated satisfactory or above. No disciplinary actions. No absences beyond the bereavement leave taken in 2018 for the death of a spouse. 3 applications for promotion to patient transport specialist in 2017, 2019, and 2021. All 3 declined. Reason noted on the first 2, position filled internally. Reason noted on the third, candidate does not meet current departmental needs. Silvana asked Preston to read that last one back to her. He did. She asked him if he knew what Wendell's first aid certification status was. Preston said he would have to check. She waited. Current, Preston said. Recertified every 2 years as required. Last renewal, 8 months ago. Silvana thanked him. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. Outside the window, the sky over Columbus was the particular gray of late October, the kind of sky that makes everything feel both quiet and unresolved. She had been chief of surgery for 11 years. She had sat on the hospital's hiring committee twice. She had reviewed compensation structures for clinical staff and argued successfully for salary adjustments 3 separate times. She had never once thought about the custodial department. Not because she was cruel. Because it had never occurred to her that there was anything to think about. That is the way invisible things work. Not through active cruelty, through the simple accumulation of not looking. In the United States, custodial and maintenance workers in healthcare facilities earn a median hourly wage of roughly $14. In the same facilities, the average department head earns a salary that is, per hour, somewhere between 15 and 20 times that amount. This is not a secret. It is available in federal labor statistics that most people in positions of authority have never read. The gap is not considered shocking because it has always been there. Because proximity to power rarely translates to proximity to compensation, and because the people who could change it are generally not the people who need to. Wendell had not complained about this. He had applied through the proper channels 3 times and been declined through the proper channels 3 times. And had continued showing up because he had a son in medical school and a floor that needed mopping. And because the alternative to showing up was something he did not allow himself to spend time considering. He was at work the next morning at 6:00, the way he always was. He was in the east corridor when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Silvana Reeves was walking toward him in a hospital gown and a cardigan that belonged to her husband, slippers on her feet, her IV line disconnected, which meant someone had either approved her walking the hall or she had simply gotten up and done it without asking. From the expression on her face, Wendell guessed the second one. "You're not supposed to be out of your room," he said. She stopped in front of him. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the mop bucket. She looked at the section of floor he had just finished. "You do this every morning," she said. "Yes. At 6. Yes. And I've walked past you at 6:17, give or take, for how many years?" He did not answer that directly. He said, "A while." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something unfamiliar on her face, the look of someone performing a calculation they had not expected to need to perform. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When you called it in, when you were waiting for the team, you talked to me." He said nothing. "I couldn't hear you," she said. "Not really, but I know someone was talking, and I know that it was the thing that kept me from going somewhere farther away." She paused, whatever that means medically. Wendell said, "You were breathing. I just didn't want you to feel like you were alone." Her jaw moved once. Something in her face shifted. Not softened, exactly. More like a wall that had been standing for a very long time had developed its first crack, thin as a thread, running deep. "I didn't know your name," she said. "No. I've worked in this building for 11 years. I know." She looked away for a moment, down the corridor, past the administrative doors, toward the place where she had been lying on the tile 48 hours ago. Then she looked back at him. "I pulled your file," she said. He looked at her steadily. He did not react. "You've applied for transport 3 times. Yes." She waited, as if there was more he wanted to say. There wasn't. "Why didn't you push back?" she asked. "File a grievance, ask for an explanation, talk to HR?" Wendell picked up his mop and moved it to a clean section of floor before he answered. Not because he was avoiding the question, because that was how he thought. With his hands doing something while his mind worked. "Because," he said finally, "pushing back in a place where you're invisible doesn't usually make you visible. It usually just makes you easier to remove." The corridor was quiet. A cart rattled somewhere deeper in the building. A PA system crackled and went silent. She said, "That's not how it should work." He said, "No, ma'am, it's not." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I owe you something I don't know how to repay." He said, "You don't owe me anything. You needed help. I was there." But he didn't say it to let her off the hook. He said it because it was true, and because he had learned the difference between grace and permission, and he was not giving her the second while offering the first. She went back to her room. He finished the corridor. Sylvana Reeves was discharged 2 days later with a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and a cardiologist she was instructed to see every 90 days. She was also discharged with something that had no clinical name. A particular kind of reckoning. The kind that happens when a person who has spent a decade being efficient and decisive suddenly has to account for the things they have been efficient and decisive about ignoring. She went back to work on a Monday. On Tuesday, she sent an email to Preston Albee, copying the hospital's HR director and the chair of the board. The subject line was "Immediate Review, Career Advancement Pathways for Non-Clinical Staff." The body of the email was 8 paragraphs long. It was specific. It named the problem not as a feeling, but as a structural failure, laid out in the precise evidence-based language that she used in surgical reports. It cited the 3 applications. It cited the dismissal reasons. It cited Wendell's first aid certification, his 19 years, his evaluations. It did not ask for a favor. It asked for an audit, a revised review process, and a timeline for implementation. She did not copy Wendell on the email. She had thought about it. She decided against it. If the system was going to change, it needed to change because it was wrong, not because one man had done one dramatic thing on one particular morning. He deserved more than to be the mascot for someone else's overdue correction. Preston Albee called her within the hour. He was the kind of administrator who managed a department for 3 years without ever questioning why it was structured the way it was. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had never been given a reason to look at something closely. Now he had a reason. The review took 6 weeks. Wendell was not told about it. He found out on a Wednesday afternoon when his supervisor, a woman named Gail, who had been in facility management for 12 years and had hired Wendell herself back when he was 39, and she had been new to the role, knocked on the door of the supply closet where he was restocking carts. Gail told him there was a meeting Friday with HR and Preston and someone from the board about his applications. Wendell put down the box of trash bags he was holding. He looked at her. "What kind of meeting?" he asked. "The good kind," Gail said. "I think." He didn't sleep Thursday night either. But this time it was different. It was not the quiet that kept him awake. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a door he had knocked on 3 times before and been told was locked. The meeting was in a conference room on the 2nd floor that Wendell had cleaned 10,000 times but had never sat in. There was a glass of water on the table in front of him. He did not touch it. Preston was there. The HR director, a woman named Camille, who spoke carefully and looked at him like she was genuinely uncertain what to say. Someone from the board whose name Wendell did not catch. And, at the far end of the table, Sylvana Reeves. She nodded at him when he walked in. He nodded back. Preston spoke first. He explained the review. He explained what they had found. He used phrases like systemic oversight and structural gap and opportunities we failed to identify, which were the phrases of a person describing failure in the passive voice, as if the failure had simply happened to the institution rather than been made by it. Wendell listened without correcting him. Then Preston said there was a position they wanted to offer him, not transport specialist. Wendell kept his face still. Preston explained. The hospital was formalizing a role that had not existed before. Patient liaison for facilities and support staff, a bridge position between non-clinical workers and patient care teams. The person in the role would coordinate support services, advocate for maintenance and environmental staff, and sit on the Interdepartmental Operations Committee. It came with a significant salary increase. It came with benefits that his current position did not include. It came with a title which Wendell had not had in 19 years. It also came, Preston said, from a direct recommendation by the chief of surgery, who had informed the board that the hospital's most significant safety asset in the East Corridor on a Tuesday morning in October had been a man whose name the institution had not bothered to learn. Wendell looked at Silvana. She was looking at the table, not avoiding his eyes, more like someone giving him privacy in a public moment. He was quiet for long enough that Camille from HR shifted in her chair. Then he said, "Can I ask one question before I answer?" Preston said yes. Wendell said, "This role, the advocacy piece, the committee seat, will it have actual authority to flag problems and have those problems acted on?" Preston looked briefly at Silvana. She said, "Yes, I'll make sure of it personally." Wendell looked at the glass of water in front of him. He thought about Isaiah. He thought about the maintenance request for the lifted tile by the pharmacy that he had submitted 4 times in the last 8 months. He thought about the flooded section of the East Corridor that had been a slip hazard for 2 years. He thought about every person who had walked past those problems the way Silvana had walked past him. "Yes," he said, "I'll take it." He started in the new role on the first Monday of December. He arrived, as he always has, early. His office was small. It had a window that faced the parking structure, not the most inspiring view, but it was a window and it was his. He put one thing on the desk, a photograph. Isaiah at his white coat ceremony, grinning in a way that made him look exactly like his mother, which still hit Wendell, sometimes like a key turning in a lock. The first thing Wendell did in his new role was walk the entire hospital with a notepad. Every corridor, every service entrance, every supply closet, every section of flooring, and every drainage issue, and every piece of equipment that was held together with workarounds that nobody above the 3rd floor knew about. He wrote it all down. He brought it to the operations committee. He presented it without editorializing, just the facts and the timeline of how long each problem had been reported without resolution. The room was very quiet when he finished. The director of operations said, "How did we not know about the East Corridor flooding?" Wendell said, "It was in the maintenance log. Submitted 9 times over 2 years." The director looked at the log, then looked back at Wendell. Wendell said, "Sometimes the problem isn't that nobody is reporting things. It's that nobody is listening to the people doing the reporting." Nobody argued with that. The tile by the pharmacy was fixed that week. The East Corridor drainage was addressed within the month. It was not a revolution. It was not the end of institutional blindness in a building that had practiced it for decades. But it was the beginning of something. And beginnings, Wendell had learned in 58 years of living, were the part that required the most faith because they looked the least like what they were going to become. 6 months after his first day in the new role, Silvana stopped him in the corridor near radiology, the same corridor, early morning. She was moving fast the way she did on surgery days. She slowed when she saw him. "Isaiah," she said, "how's he doing?" Wendell looked at her. He had mentioned his son exactly once in a conversation she had initiated in her hospital room. She had remembered. "He finished his 2nd year," Wendell said. "Top of his class in anatomy." She nodded, like it was what she expected. "Cardiology?" she asked. "He wants to do emergency medicine," Wendell said. "Good," she said. "We need more people who don't wait to be asked before they act." She kept walking. Wendell watched her go. Then he pulled out his notepad and continued down the corridor the way he always did. Looking at what needed looking at. Writing down what needed to be written. Doing the work that does not get done unless someone decides it is worth doing, regardless of whether anyone is watching. The East Corridor was clean. The floor was even. The drainage was clear. A morning shift nurse walked past him without looking up from her phone. He noted a loose ceiling tile 3 doors down from radiology and wrote up the work order before he reached the end of the hallway. Some things change slowly. Some things change because one person keeps paying attention long enough for someone else to finally stop and look. Wendell Okafor had been paying attention for 19 years. He was just getting started.